I've never been one to believe in scary stories, the kind people tell to pass the time or spook each other. I always thought there was a logical explanation for everything. But this was different. I'm a teacher, living in a small town. I work at a school about 20 miles from my house, which means I have to drive along a long, deserted highway every day. This happened 2 years ago, on a particularly cold autumn night. I'd stayed late at school grading papers, so by the time I got into my car, it was already past 10. All I wanted was to get home and collapse into bed, but that dark stretch of highway felt endless. The silence was almost complete, except for the hum of my car engine and the occasional rustling of the trees lining the road. The stretch between my town and the school is a long, straight path with few lights and no houses nearby. I was used to it, but something felt off that night. I can't really explain it. Maybe it was the feeling of being watched, or the way the fog seemed thicker than usual. I remember gripping the wheel tightly when I saw something ahead, a figure on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was waving, asking for help. I hesitated, but eventually stopped the car. My conscience wouldn't let me drive past her. I knew it was dangerous to stop on a dark road at night, but what if she was really in trouble? The woman looked to be in her 30s, with messy brown hair and a coat that seemed far too light for the cold night. When I rolled down the window, she ran toward the car. "Please, my car broke down back there and my phone doesn't have signal. Can you help me?" she said, breathless. Her face looked desperate, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match her story. It was a look I can only describe as empty. I tried to stay calm as she talked, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. "Where's your car?" I asked, trying to look past her through the window. She pointed back toward the darkness, but when I followed her gesture, I couldn't see a car anywhere. "It's just over there near the trees," she insisted, but something about her voice made my stomach churn. And then I noticed it. Someone, or something, was hiding in the shadows near the trees. I couldn't make out much, but I was sure I saw a pair of eyes glinting for just a moment. My heart started racing. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The woman kept talking, gesturing wildly as if trying to distract me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I was imagining things or if there really was someone in those shadows. That's when she took a step closer, leaning further into my window. "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" "That's all I need," she insisted, but there was something unsettling about her tone. It almost sounded rehearsed. My mouth went dry and all I managed to say was, "What about your car? Wouldn't it be better to wait for a tow truck here?" Her response came too quickly, like she had it ready. No, the tow truck could take hours. I just need to get out of here." When she said that, I noticed her eyes shift for a second, like she was checking on something behind her. My stomach churned. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to confirm that she wasn't alone. I tried to glance discreetly toward the roadside, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. Even so, the sensation of being watched was almost tangible. "Look," I said, trying to sound firm but not aggressive, "I can call someone to help you, but I don't think it's safe for you to be walking around here alone." It was a weak excuse, and I knew it, but I just needed time to think. The woman seemed impatient. She glanced back at the road, almost nervously, and then took a step back. "Fine, call whoever you want, but I need to get out of here now." That's when I heard it. A sharp snap, like a branch breaking, coming from the trees. It was the confirmation I dreaded. Someone was there, hiding. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't just drive off without a word, because that might make them act faster. But I also couldn't let her into my car. I decided to take a risk. "I'll call the police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while I grabbed my phone. But before I could unlock the screen, she gave me a strange smile, almost like a sneer, and said, "Oh, there's no need for that. We've already taken care of it." "Taken care of what?" Before I could process her words, she took another step back, still staring at me as she slowly moved away. The woman's smile sent a chill down my spine. It was like she knew something I didn't, like she had planned every second of our interaction. She kept backing away, but her eyes never left mine. That's when I saw a silhouette emerge from the trees. It was a tall man, dressed in dark clothing, holding something long in his hands, maybe a piece of wood or even a tool. My body froze as I watched the scene unfold. He looked at the woman and then directly at me. I can't explain it, but his gaze felt like it pierced right through me. Without thinking twice, I locked the car doors and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The engine roared as the car sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw them both run onto the road, as if trying to chase after me. The woman was shouting something, but her voice was muffled by the distance and the sheer panic coursing through me. My only thought was to get as far away as possible. The road seemed endless, and every second felt like an eternity. Even after I lost sight of them, I kept driving, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I finally saw the lights of the town ahead, my body nearly collapsed with relief. I pulled into the first gas station I found and called the police. I tried to explain everything, though my voice was shaky and my thoughts scattered. The officer who answered said they'd send a patrol car to check the stretch of highway, but honestly, I don't know if they ever found anything. I went home that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the woman's smile, the man's stare, and that overwhelming sense of danger. To this day, I don't know what really happened or who those people were. There were no reports of a broken-down car or anyone asking for help on that road. Some friends suggested I was just overtired and imagining things, but I know what I saw. Those eyes in the shadows, that smile, they were real. Since then, I've avoided driving alone at night, especially on that stretch of road. And every time I think about stopping to help someone, I remember that woman and wonder, what if I had let her into my car? I'm a nurse, and this story happened a few months ago after one of the longest shifts of my life. At the time, I worked at a hospital in Los Angeles, but lived in a more suburban area, meaning I had to drive almost an hour to get home. That day had been particularly exhausting because I had to cover for a coworker who didn't show up for the night shift. After nearly 18 hours on my feet, all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and collapse in bed. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I got into my car. The streets were deserted, except for a few cabs and rideshare drivers. I decided to take the shortest route home, a stretch of road near Hollywood Boulevard that felt lonely but not dangerous at that hour. I was too tired to turn on the radio, so the only sound in the car was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. My whole body ached, my eyes were burning, and I was on autopilot. That's when I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror appearing out of nowhere. I figured it was just another driver heading home or to work. But soon I realized those headlights were closer than I expected. The driver was tailgating me, which started to irritate me. "What's the rush?" I muttered to myself. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, but the car behind me sped up as well. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just an impatient driver. After a few minutes, I decided to change lanes to let them pass. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed the car also changed lanes, staying at the same distance. Even then, I tried to rationalize it. Okay, maybe they're just going the same way, I thought. But to test the theory, I switched lanes again, and just like a shadow, the car behind me mirrored my movement. That's when I started feeling uneasy. The exhaustion was replaced by a strange alertness, a cold knot forming in my stomach that I couldn't ignore. I decided to take a random turn down a darker, quieter street just to see if they'd follow. They did. At this point, my breathing quickened, and that familiar surge of adrenaline I usually reserved for emergencies kicked in. My mind raced through possible explanations, from an annoyed driver to something far more sinister. I was alone, tired, and caught in a game I didn't know how to win. As I kept driving, my eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, tracking every move of that car. It wasn't getting closer, but it wasn't backing off either. It felt like the driver wanted me to know they were there, watching me. The silence in the car was deafening, and I started to notice things I hadn't before. The sound of my heavy breathing, the faint hum of the tires on the road, the rapid thud of my heartbeat that made me feel like I was choking. I decided to take a completely different route, one that was definitely out of the way home. I exited toward an unfamiliar neighborhood just to see if they'd stop following. But they didn't stop. Every turn, every exit, every detour, I wasn't shaking them off. My mind started flooding with every scary story I'd ever heard or read. People disappearing, being chased into tragedy. For a brief moment, I considered stopping the car and confronting them, but I dismissed the idea as quickly as it came. I didn't know who was in that car or what they were capable of. Plus, I had nothing to defend myself with, not even a pocket knife. So, I kept driving, trying to come up with a plan. I grabbed my phone, but my hands were trembling so badly it took me a few tries to unlock it. I thought about calling the police, but what if it was just a coincidence? I didn't want to come off as paranoid or make a false report. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The street I was on was completely deserted. No stores, no other cars, no living soul in sight. It was just me, my little sedan, and that car, its headlights burning into my rearview mirror. Then, suddenly, it started getting closer. My skin prickled with goosebumps as they seemed to be testing my limits, deliberately provoking me. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb. Think, 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 I whispered to myself, desperately searching for a way out. But at that moment, it felt like every escape was sealed off. I decided I needed to find a public place, a gas station, a drive-through, anything. Then I saw it, a small gas station up ahead, its lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief and veered toward it, almost missing the entrance in my haste. As soon as I pulled in, I slowed down and parked near the convenience store. The car behind me also slowed down, but stopped on the far side of the lot, keeping its distance. My heart was hammering as I debated what to do. Do I get out? Stay in? What if they come after me? My thoughts were a whirlwind, and the adrenaline was making it hard to think straight. I grabbed my phone again and started dialing the police, but before I hit call, I glanced at the car. It was still there, headlights on, but no one had stepped out. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it really just be a coincidence? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something deliberate about the way they had followed me, mirroring my every move. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. If they kept following me, at least I'd have more proof that I wasn't imagining things. I started my car and pulled out of the gas station slowly, trying not to draw attention. Once I was back on the road, I saw the car's headlights flicker on again, and it began following me. This time, I was ready to act. I turned my signal onto the right, but abruptly veered left, hoping to confuse them. The sharp turn made my tires screech, but I didn't care. In my rearview mirror, I saw the car hesitate briefly before continuing after me, though it had fallen slightly behind. That brief distance gave me a small sense of relief and a chance to think. I knew I needed to draw attention to myself, something that would make the person behind me think twice before continuing. I drove toward a more populated area of the city, where I knew there would be more cars and maybe even a police presence. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Then, as if by a stroke of luck, I saw it. A police station, its lights glowing brightly on the left side of the road. Without hesitation, I turned into the parking lot and parked right in front of the building. I sat there for a moment, staring at the rearview mirror, waiting to see what the car would do. To my surprise, it didn't follow me in. Instead, it drove past the station and disappeared down the street. I sat frozen in my seat, trying to process what had just happened. After a few moments, I finally mustered the courage to step out of my car and go inside. A middle-aged officer greeted me with a tired but kind expression, and I quickly explained everything that had happened. My words were jumbled, and I could feel my voice shaking, but he listened patiently, asking a few clarifying questions. He took my statement and said they would review nearby security cameras to try to identify the vehicle. I sat in the waiting area, my nerves still on edge as they worked on pulling footage from the gas station and surrounding streets. After about 20 minutes, the officer returned with a serious look on his face. "We found the car you mentioned on one of the recordings," he said. "It looks like they followed you for quite a while, but once you entered here, they drove off." I asked if they had identified the driver or noticed anything else suspicious, but he shook his head. The plates were covered, likely on purpose. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. On one hand, the car was no longer behind me. On the other, knowing someone had deliberately obscured their plates and followed me like that made the situation even more unsettling. The officer advised me to change my daily route and stay alert for any unusual behavior on the road. He also told me to call the police immediately if anything similar ever happened again. I thanked him and left the station, but I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked back to my car. The drive home was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me hold my breath, and it wasn't until I finally parked in my driveway that I felt even a sliver of safety. To this day, I have no idea who was in that car or what they wanted. Some nights, I still dream about those headlights following me, the same suffocating anxiety washing over me in my sleep. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that trusting your instincts can save your life. Maybe if I hadn't driven to that police station, things would have ended very differently. I'll never know for sure, and that, in itself, is something that continues to haunt me. I had just finished my sophomore year of college, and that night I decided to go out with some friends to a bar near campus. It was a Friday in early fall, and the city seemed alive with energy. After a few hours of chatting and laughing, I realized I had missed the last bus home. My apartment was about a 30-minute drive away, and I wasn't in the mood to walk alone through deserted streets at that hour. I pulled out my phone and called for a rideshare. The driver arrived quickly, which was a relief since the cold wind was starting to cut through my jacket. When the car pulled up beside me, the driver rolled down the window. He was a man in his mid-40s with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had a scruffy beard and wore a worn-out baseball cap. The car, an old sedan with a strong pine scent, seemed well kept, though there was duct tape covering a crack on the dashboard. "You're Ryan, right?" he asked, checking the name on the app. I nodded and got into the back seat. He seemed friendly at first, asking generic questions about the weather and how busy the city was that night. I was tired, so I responded with short answers, hoping he'd get the hint. About 10 minutes into the ride, his questions started to change. He asked where I went to school, if I lived alone, and what my daily routine was like. At first, it didn't seem too odd, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. His voice was unnervingly calm, like he was carefully picking each word. Then he asked if anyone knew I had called for the ride. That sent a chill down my spine. I lied, saying a friend had walked me to the car and was tracking my trip on their phone. He let out a low chuckle, like he found my response amusing. That's when discomfort turned into fear. Instead of sticking to the normal route, he made a sudden left onto a narrow, unlit road that wasn't part of the app's suggested path. I glanced at my phone and saw the route had completely changed, but he hadn't said anything. "This way's faster," he said, even though I hadn't asked. My heart started to race, and a suffocating sense of dread settled over me. The sound of the tires crunching gravel seemed to echo in the silence, each crack amplifying the panic I was desperately trying to suppress. As the car moved further down the deserted road, every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. The trees lining the road cast long, distorted shadows under the weak beam of the headlights. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were sweating as I gripped my phone. I looked at the app's map and saw he had completely veered off the original route. "Hey, this doesn't seem right. I think you should head back to the main road," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. He replied without looking at me, his tone icy. "Relax, we're almost there." I didn't believe him for a second. My mind raced with every article I'd ever read about people disappearing in situations like this. My brain was working overtime, trying to decide what to do. Should I pretend everything was fine? Confront him? Jump out of the moving car? Meanwhile, he kept driving, the road growing more isolated with every mile. The silence in the car was unbearable, broken only by the hum of the engine and the pounding of my own heart, which seemed deafening. I forced myself to look out the window, trying to memorize landmarks, but everything looked the same: trees, shadows, and darkness. Then he started talking again, but this time his tone had shifted. It was almost a whisper. "You know, most people don't really pay attention to what's around them. It's amazing how everyone just trusts technology to tell them where they are," he said, glancing at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes locking onto mine. "Ever notice how sometimes people just disappear?" His words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a casual question. It felt more like a warning. My hands shook, and my mind scrambled for an excuse, something to buy me time. Yeah, my dad just called me. I need to answer," I lied, pretending to fumble with my phone. When I unlocked the screen, I realized I had no signal. My stomach dropped. The driver gave a slow, knowing smile as if he could read my thoughts. "Ah, no service out here? That's a shame," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. At that moment, my adrenaline kicked into overdrive. I glanced at the car door, calculating the possibility of opening it and jumping out. But the car was speeding up, and I knew the fall could be fatal. Without thinking much, I reached for my backpack on the seat next to me, pretending to rummage through it. "Got anything sharp in there?" he asked suddenly, his tone almost casual. I nearly dropped the bag, but managed to mumble something unintelligible while my brain screamed, "Run!" My mind was in full alert mode, and every second in that car felt like an eternity. While pretending to rummage through my backpack, I remembered the small metal flashlight I always carried. It wasn't exactly a weapon, but at that moment, it felt like my only chance. I gripped the flashlight tightly, trying to keep my expression neutral. He started mumbling something to himself, words that didn't make sense but made my fear skyrocket. I tried to glance at the car's dashboard to see how fast we were going, but the speedometer was broken, its numbers faded. The feeling of being trapped only grew stronger. When he turned again, this time onto an even narrower path surrounded by towering trees, I made an instant decision. I knew I couldn't wait to find out what he had planned. "Stop the car! I'm not feeling well. I need to get out now," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. He didn't respond, but slowed down slightly, which only made my anxiety worse. I took my chance, and with all the strength I had, slammed the flashlight against the back of his seat, aiming for him. I didn't know if I'd hit him, but I needed to create a distraction. He let out a surprised yell, and the car swerved sharply to the side. That was my opening. Without thinking twice, I unlocked the door and threw myself out. The fall was rough, and I felt the skin on my arms scrape against the gravel, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The car stopped a few yards ahead, and for a moment, I thought he was going to turn around and chase me. But instead, it just stayed there, its headlights illuminating the empty road. I ran in the opposite direction, plunging into the forest. The darkness was almost total, and every step seemed to echo among the trees, but running felt like the only option that made sense. As I got farther away, I heard the sound of the car engine starting again, but it didn't head in my direction. Instead, the noise grew fainter and eventually disappeared altogether. My legs were shaking and my chest burned from running. I leaned against a tree to catch my breath, trying to process what had just happened. I pulled out my phone again, and this time, there was a signal. With trembling hands, I called the police and tried to explain the situation. They said they'd send a patrol car to pick me up, but the wait felt endless. I stayed hidden among the trees, terrified that he might come back. When I finally saw the flashing lights of the patrol car approaching, a wave of relief washed over me so strong that my legs nearly gave out. I stepped out of the forest cautiously, raising my hands to show I wasn't a threat. The officers helped me into the car, and as I recounted the story, I realized my voice was still trembling. They seemed to take the situation seriously, but when I mentioned the detour and the isolated road, one of the officers shook his head with a tense expression. "We've heard reports of something like this before, but we've never been able to identify the driver," he said. His words sent another chill down my spine. I wasn't the only one who had experienced this. Back at the station, they asked me to describe the driver and the car. I did my best to recall every detail, but my mind felt foggy from the adrenaline. I found out that, somehow, the app hadn't logged the ride. It was as if it had never happened. Without the trip history, the officers said it would be hard to track the driver, but they promised to investigate further. Still, I had the sinking feeling that this would just become another cold case, filed away like so many others. The days that followed were difficult. I had constant nightmares about the deserted road and the driver's cold smile in the rearview mirror. It felt like he was always watching me, even when I was alone in my apartment. I spent weeks afraid to go out at night or call for another rideshare. Gradually, life began to return to normal, but that feeling of vulnerability never fully went away. Every time I see headlights behind me on a deserted road, I get that same icy sensation in my spine. To this day, I don't know what he planned to do to me that night, but I know it wouldn't have ended well if I hadn't acted quickly. Sharing this story here is the only way I've found to process what happened. I hope it serves as a warning to all of you. Never blindly trust the person behind the wheel, no matter how harmless they seem at first. And above all, always listen to that instinct that tells you when something is wrong. It might just save your life. I've been a rideshare driver for almost 2 years, always working the night shift. It's not exactly a dream job, but it pays the bills. At the time, I was getting over a messy breakup and needed to keep my mind occupied. Driving late at night was perfect for that. Fewer distractions, less traffic, and believe it or not, a certain kind of peace. That was before that ride. What happened that night made me rethink everything, including whether it was worth staying in this line of work. It was a Thursday around 2 a.m, and the city was practically empty. I had just finished a quiet ride when the app pinged me with another request. The address was in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with, far from the city center. I thought about canceling, but the night bonus was too tempting. Driving there felt strange. The streets were poorly lit, and the houses looked like they hadn't been maintained in years. When I arrived, I waited for a good 2 minutes before seeing any sign of life. A man emerged from a rusty gate, walking slowly, almost as if he didn't want to be seen. He was wearing dark, scruffy clothes and an old jacket that looked like it had been through decades of wear. He opened the back door and got in without saying a word. He just gave me a quick nod, like it was a reflex. At that moment, I figured he might just be tired or not in the mood to talk, which was pretty common. But there was something about him, something that made me uneasy right away. I always try to make small talk with passengers, even if it's just about something simple. It helps pass the time and usually makes the ride less awkward. I asked where he was headed, but he just showed me the address on his phone. I stayed quiet for a few minutes, but that weird feeling lingered. He had a backpack on his lap, and his fingers were fidgeting with something inside it. I couldn't see what it was, but the sound of plastic and metal rubbing together echoed in the silence of the car. The more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the more wrong it all felt. I tried to focus on the road, but my curiosity was eating away at me. His silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Every now and then, I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, trying to catch some expression, anything that could put me at ease, but his face was partially hidden by the shadow of his hood. The only thing I could see were his eyes, dark, sunken, and with an unsettling glint that seemed to pierce right through me. I've had all kinds of passengers before, but I had never felt this uncomfortable. About 10 minutes later, he finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost raspy. "Can you stop up ahead?" he said, pointing to a side road that wasn't on the app's suggested route. I checked the GPS to confirm, and of course, the route didn't go that way. "It's quicker this way," he added, still not making eye contact. Every instinct in me screamed not to take the detour, but at the same time, I didn't want to risk upsetting him. So, I did what he asked and turned down the road. This new route was completely deserted, a narrow road flanked by tall, dark trees. The car's headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, and the silence was eerily absolute. I tried to break the tension with some small talk. "This area's pretty isolated, huh?" But he didn't respond. He just kept fiddling with his backpack, and now the sound of metal was louder. My mind started racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he's armed? I thought. My hands were so sweaty on the steering wheel that I had to wipe them on my pants. Suddenly, he asked me to stop. Just like that, out of nowhere. "Here's fine," he said, pointing to the shoulder of the road, where there was nothing but pitch-black darkness. I pulled over slowly, but every nerve in my body was on high alert, screaming at me to turn around and get out of there. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there, still fidgeting with his bag. The silence was unbearable. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then he started unzipping the bag, very slowly, like he wanted to draw out the moment. I was frozen in my seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. My mind was racing, trying to guess what he was about to pull out of the bag. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glint of something metallic, but before I could see more clearly, he stopped moving and looked straight at me through the rearview mirror. "Why are you nervous?" he asked, his tone calm, almost mocking. His question caught me off guard. I stammered something like, "I'm not, just tired," but my voice came out weak, almost trembling. He let out a low chuckle, dry and emotionless. "Relax, man. I just need to do something here, and then I'll get out," he said. Before I could ask what he meant, he opened the door and stepped out, carrying the backpack with him. The darkness of the area swallowed him almost immediately, but I could hear his footsteps heading toward the trees. I sat there, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to drive off as fast as I could, but another part was consumed by curiosity. Something about this guy didn't add up, and I needed to know what he was hiding. I waited for about 2 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Then, I made a decision. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping out of the car cautiously. The cold air hit me, and the silence was so deep that even my own footsteps sounded deafening. I walked a few steps in the direction he had gone, but I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows shifting with the wind. My heart was racing so hard I thought I might pass out. Then I heard it, the sharp snap of a twig being stepped on. The flashlight beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. His backpack was lying on the ground, unzipped, and next to it was a hunting knife with a massive blade still gleaming in the light. Before I could react, I felt movement behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. He was standing there, just a few feet away, with a twisted smile on his face and his eyes locked onto mine. "You really should have stayed in the car," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. At that moment, I realized my curiosity might have been the biggest mistake of my life. Panic took over me. I stepped back, almost tripping, as he stood there, gripping the knife. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body felt frozen in place. "Relax, man, no need to freak out," he said, taking a step closer. But the knife gleaming in his hand told me otherwise. In a burst of adrenaline, I turned and sprinted back toward the car. I could hear him yelling something behind me, but the pounding of my heart drowned out the words. I threw myself into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine with trembling hands. He appeared outside the window, slamming the knife against the glass, his face twisted with rage. "You're just gonna leave me here?" he shouted, but I was already flooring the gas. The sound of the tires screeching was the only thing I could hear as I sped away from that place. Only when I reached a well-lit gas station a few minutes later did I realize how badly I was shaking. I parked the car and tried to catch my breath. Then I called the police and explained what had happened, though I struggled to find the right words. The address he used to request the ride was fake, and when the cops checked the area, they found nothing. No man, no backpack. It was like he had vanished into thin air. To this day, I wonder what could have happened if I hadn't run. After that night, I decided to quit working the night shift. Something about that experience left a mark on me that I can't shake off. Every now and then, when I think about his eyes or that unsettling smile, I get chills down my spine. And I always wonder, has he done this before? Or worse, did he try again with someone else? I don't think I'll ever have those answers, but one thing's for sure. I'll never pick up another passenger at that time of night again. I've never been a fan of driving at night, but at that time, I didn't have much of a choice. It was early September, and I was driving back from a quick visit to my sister, who lived about 120 miles away. The route was mostly an endless rural highway surrounded by open fields and trees that seemed almost alive in the dark. My car was old, one of those models only you know how to handle, and the dashboard lights occasionally flickered as if reminding me they were as tired as I was. The night was cold, and the only thing keeping me company was a playlist of songs I didn't even remember why I had saved. I'd been driving for almost an hour when I noticed a car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Seeing someone on that road at that time was rare, but not impossible. What caught my attention was when their headlights flashed for the first time. Okay, maybe they're just adjusting their lights, I thought, but then they flashed again. I glanced at my rearview mirror, confused. Is something wrong with my car? I fiddled with the dashboard controls and checked the mirrors. Everything seemed fine, yet the car behind me kept flashing its lights, this time more insistently. My heart began to race. I slowed down, trying to figure out what the driver wanted. They kept their distance but continued flashing their lights as if they were trying to send me an urgent message. I tried convincing myself it might be something wrong with my car, like a flat tire or a broken light. That's when I decided to pull over. The road was deserted, but the shoulder was wide enough. I turned on my hazard lights and slowed to a stop. The other car also stopped, but a few yards back, keeping its headlights glaring at me. I waited a few seconds, watching the rearview mirror, expecting the driver to step out and tell me what was so important. But they didn't. No movement, no door opening, nothing. Just their headlights blinding me, making me feel more and more uneasy. The silence of the night felt heavier, and suddenly my car, my old, faithful car that always seemed ready to give up on me, had never felt so vulnerable. Something was wrong, very wrong. Seconds felt like minutes as I stared at the rearview mirror, waiting for any movement from the car. My breathing grew shallow, and the air inside the car felt heavier with each passing second. I instinctively pressed the button to lock the doors, the click echoing in the silence, almost like confirmation that something was wrong. Maybe they're waiting for me to get out, I thought. But why? If it was something urgent, like a flat tire, they would have already approached me. None of it made sense. I turned the engine back on, determined to get out of there. The moment I stepped on the gas, the other car's engine roared to life too. My heart was pounding now. They weren't trying to help me. They were following me. I kept my foot pressed on the pedal, speeding more than I should on that narrow, winding road. The car behind me matched my speed, its headlights flashing just as aggressively as before, almost like it wanted to force me to stop again. The fear inside me grew stronger with every mile. It felt like each flash of those headlights was whispering something terrible I didn't want to understand. I kept driving, trying to stay calm, but my thoughts were chaotic. What did they want? Were they trying to rob me? Hurt me? Or worse, did they know something I didn't? I glanced at the dashboard, struggling to stay focused, but my hands were sweaty and shaking on the wheel. The road seemed endless, and I had no idea where the next gas station or even a house with lights might be. My phone's GPS wasn't helping, stubbornly displaying no signal, as if conspiring with the night to make me feel even more helpless. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a small side road ahead. It was a dirt path lined with tall trees that formed a natural tunnel. Without thinking too much, I turned sharply, the tires skidding on the gravel. I hoped the car behind me would continue on the main road, but to my horror, it turned as well. The gap between us was closing, and I began to feel like no matter what I did, they weren't going to stop. The sound of gravel hitting the sides of my car was almost as loud as my heavy breathing. The dirt road was full of tight curves, and the towering trees around it made everything feel even more claustrophobic. The car behind me continued following my every move, its headlights flashing relentlessly. The only thing running through my mind was, why are they doing this? What do they want from me? I couldn't shake the overwhelming terror of being completely alone, with no one around to help. My vision began to blur from constantly glancing at the rearview mirror, but then something caught my eye. In the flashes of light from the car behind me, I noticed a strange reflection in the back of my car. Something moving. My stomach churned. I quickly glanced at the back seat through the interior mirror, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. Suddenly, everything clicked. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to warn me. My entire body went cold, and my mind was flooded with terrifying possibilities. A thief? A killer? I couldn't remember stopping or letting anyone into my car, but at that moment, nothing felt impossible. My priorities shifted instantly. I had to stop the car and figure out what was happening. But how? There was nowhere safe to pull over, and the car behind me showed no signs of backing off. Finally, I saw a clearing ahead, with a small, abandoned cabin barely visible under the faint moonlight. Without much thought, I veered off the road and stopped abruptly. I jumped out of the car, forgetting my phone and even to turn off the engine. I shouted at the driver behind me, hoping they'd finally explain what was going on. They pulled up a few yards behind me, got out quickly, and yelled, "Don't go back to your car! Someone's inside!" Time seemed to freeze when those words left his mouth. My body was paralyzed, and the air around me felt like it had been sucked away. Someone's inside. The words echoed in my head, but my brain refused to process them. My first instinct was to look at the car, as if I could see something through the dark windows, but all I could see was the glare of the other car's headlights. "I saw him sitting up in the back seat when you turned onto that dirt road," the man shouted, walking toward me quickly. He looked genuinely terrified, his voice trembling and his hands raised, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "I was following you because I didn't know how else to warn you." He kept glancing at my car with an expression of pure fear, like he was expecting something awful to happen at any moment. Without thinking, I slowly started backing away from my car. My breathing was shallow, and my whole body felt numb with panic. "Are you sure about what you saw?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He nodded frantically. "Yes, I saw him clearly. He was crouching down, trying not to be seen. He was there when you passed that crossroads before turning onto the dirt road." Every instinct in me screamed to abandon the car and run, but how could I just leave everything behind? My phone, my wallet, my life was inside that car. As I wrestled with my thoughts, the man whispered, "Look at the back seat, but do it from far away." He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and aimed it at my car. The shaky beam of light cut through the rear window, briefly illuminating the interior. It was enough for me to see movement. Something or someone was there, and they moved slowly, almost deliberately. My body was flooded with a mix of panic and adrenaline. Without thinking much, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed the police. The man beside me kept his flashlight trained on the car, his eyes wide as if he feared any sudden move would make things worse. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I tried to explain the situation as clearly as possible, but my voice was trembling so much I had to repeat myself. "There's someone in my car. I'm being followed. Please send help." As I spoke, I heard a sound coming from my car. A click, like the sound of the door locks disengaging. The man beside me stepped back, pulling something from his pocket. It was a tire iron, probably something he had grabbed from his own car. He raised it, his hands shaking, as if he was ready to face whatever was about to come out. "Get ready to run," he whispered. The back door of my car slowly creaked open. I could barely breathe, my eyes fixed on the darkness inside. Then a figure emerged. A tall, gaunt man with torn clothes and a face that didn't seem to belong to this world. His eyes were sunken, almost lifeless, but the twisted grin on his face sent a chill down my spine. In his hand, he held something, a small rusted knife that glinted faintly under the flashlight's beam. Without thinking, I turned and ran toward the forest that surrounded the clearing. The man beside me shouted something I couldn't understand, but within seconds, he was running alongside me. The darkness between the trees was suffocating, but fear kept us moving. Behind us, we could hear heavy footsteps, snapping branches and crunching leaves on the ground. After what felt like hours, we saw lights in the distance. It was a small gas station, isolated but glowing like a sanctuary in the middle of the darkness. We ran inside, nearly slamming the door behind us. The clerk looked startled as I tried to explain between sobs what had just happened. He quickly locked the door and called the police. We stayed there, breathless and silent, waiting. When the police arrived, they found my car abandoned. There was no sign of the man or the knife. They searched the area around the car and the forest, but found nothing except footprints leading back into the woods. To this day, I don't know who that man was or how he got into my car. But every time I drive at night, I get a chill down my spine, as if there are still eyes watching me from the shadows.